So, as promised, this is a little recap for the skeletal system. Um, and so, here are the key takeaways. As usual, these really summarize everything that is very important in the lecture, right? So, you should understand all these terms. Plus, go through the slides, and certain questions might be a little bit more picky about details, right? But this really helps with the big picture. As usual, you have your learning objectives. Again, that should help you guide your studying. Here are some resources if you're more of a reading person. And so we start with the first part, organization and function of the skeletal system. So very briefly, right, the major five things about bones, their functions, they support the body, right? They are this legitimate skeleton. When we say something's a skeleton, they're the framework that things build on, right, such as tissues and organs. They protect soft organs. The skull protects the brain, vertebrae protect the spine, the ribs protect the lungs, the sternum protects the heart, right? So there's all these bones that help protect our soft organs. They produce blood cells. We'll see that in the marrow. Um, we produce a lot of blood cells. This is called hematopoiesis, which you'll see a lot more in the next bio course. Stores lipids and calcium. There's also this yellow bone marrow, and we'll see that that stores lipids in bones. But also, bone is made up of full of calcium and phosphorus, right? So we're actually storing minerals. And if our body needs calcium, we know calcium's important in neurons, right? We saw that they're used there. It's also very important in muscle. So if our body needs it, well, it'll maybe chew off a bit of bone to release some of that calcium that's there. And lastly, bones, they act as levers for muscles. This is the main thing you think about, right? The skeleton, right, is really useless for movement unless you have bones on top of it that pull them and move them in certain ways. So whenever you see an X, don't worry too much about those slides. It's just that they're not important for our final exam. And they probably, you've seen them maybe in lab or somewhere else, so don't worry about slides with X's. Chopping. All right, so classification of bones. We talked about the fact that there were four main categories of bones, right? There are long bones. These are the typical bones with two heads at each end and a long middle section, right? So these are all the bones of the limbs, the arms and the legs, except a few exceptions. The patella, the wrist bone has these small square bones, and the ankles have little small square bones. Short bones are the ones I just talked about in the wrist, right? You see these square cube-like shaped? They're found in the wrist and the ankles. These are called short. And the flat bones, right? These are thin, flat, and at times they're slightly curved, okay? So bones of the cranium in the skull, right? All of the cranial bones that are protecting our brain, they're flat and they're very thin. They're a little bit curved, right? They make this rounded shape, but all those bones, they are considered flat bones. The sternum is a very flat bone, and the ribs, they are curved a little, but they're flat too. If you look at it, it's very thin and flat. Anything else we don't know what to call, we call them irregular bones, such as this weird vertebrae over here. All right. Next thing is that there are two main structural arrangements for bones. Bones could be either spongy or they could be compact. So when you think typically of bones, you always think of compact. This is like a brick wall. They're very solid. Do you see this outer thick lining of the bone on the outside, right? There's no visible spaces in between, right? This is optimized for strength and hardness. It's a good outside, right? And they're located on the edges of all the bones, right? You see the bone over here, all the edge, the outer part is compact bone. Spongy bone is its characteristics, it looks like a sponge. Do you see these little holes everywhere, right? This is kind of like a scaffold, right? It's very good and sturdy, right, on the inside to have this. So it's built like this scaffold and it reduces the weight. Imagine if all our bone was this compact bone, we would be super heavy and we wouldn't be able to even lift ourselves. So we need spongy bone in the middle to kind of make it a bit lighter. And in these spaces, in the holes, we could actually have these spaces filled with what we call marrow. We'll see red marrow and yellow marrow. This is a place where we could have some blood forming cells, these stem cells for blood in the marrow. We're gonna see this red bone marrow. So spongy bone, I need you to know that this is located deep in the internal part of the bone, right? Internally in the middle of the bone is spongy. On the outsides is compact bone, okay? So what is the periosteum and endosteum? Connective tissue, these are different types of connective tissue that provide blood, nerves, and attachment points, and they have some bone stem cells in them. So periosteum, peri means around, osteum means bone. So this tissue, do you see if I slice this bone here, this long bone, in the middle, in the shaft of the bone, I cut it in the middle, there's like this outer part, and then there's this inner part in the middle. This outer part, that covers the outside part, you have this layer here, right? All of this stuff is bone, but this outer connective tissue, this is covers the outside of the bone, and this is where tendons and ligaments interact with the bone, right? Sometimes little tendons or ligaments of the tendons of muscle, right? They need to interact with the bone. So this is oftentimes where this happens. Another function of it is that it's active during bone growth and repair. If our bone needs to grow or fix a little fracture, these cells here are full of what we call these progenitor cells, osteoprogenitor cells, which make new bone. So they are stem cells of the bone. Um, it also this periosteum provides a route for blood vessels. Blood needs to get into these cells, these inner cells here. So oftentimes blood vessels get squished in through this periosteum. What else? Endosteum, endo means within, right? Osteum means bone. So do you see this inner layer here, right? Do you see this inner layer around the middle, right? This middle part in red is actually empty. It's called the medullary cavity. In the shaft of the bone, this part is empty and it's like a hole in the middle. It might have some marrow in it, but apart from that, it's empty. So these cells here around that line the medullary cavity, we'll see. This is called the endosteum. Remember in muscle, like endomysium, endo means on the inside, right? So endosteum is the inner lining of cells that are in the osteum in the bone. This lines all the inner surface of bone. For example, it lines the medullary cavity, as I just said. It's active during bone growth and repair too. So when a bone breaks, right, or it needs to grow, the outer ring of the bone needs to have some cells to grow, maybe in width, right? And the inner part too needs to have some cells that might want to grow on the inside, right? So it's good that these outer and inner linings of the bone, they have some cells that could grow and repair. Now, what is bone marrow? There are two types of tissues that fill the space inside the bone. Remember what we said about the inner bone? This is called spongy bone in the middle, right? This spongy bone in the middle, not the compact on the outside, the spongy bone in the middle is filled up with stuff. Some of this stuff, like the stuff over at the tops of the bone, the heads of the bone, in the spongy bone at the heads, right, we call this red marrow, red bone marrow. This is the site of hematopoiesis. Hemato, like Hema, Quebec. Hemato means blood. Poiesis means to produce. So this is where we produced all of our blood cells. This is the where the progenitors are of our blood cells. And you'll see that later on in the next course of bio. Um, these cells over here, right? You may have heard of eating red bone marrow. This is actually a delicacy of for food. This is all these red blood cells over here. Um, this hematopoiesis, right, is found, as I said, only in the spongy bone in adults. So in children, everything is red bone marrow, but in adults, this red bone marrow is just on the heads, right? So if I go back over here, you see this spongy bone in the middle. All of this would be red bone marrow, okay? And so these are, we're going to see this is called the epiphysis of the long bone. This long bone here, this head is called the epiphysis. Epi means on top, so the head of the bone is full of red bone marrow, only on the inside, right? Um, in babies, actually, you don't need to know this for the test, but primary marrow types in baby is red bone marrow. So all bones in babies are oftentimes red bone marrow. But in adulthood, we have it just at the epiphysis, okay? So it's only at the tops. The middle part, the shaft of the bone, this middle section, right? Remember I told you it's hollowed out a lot. Um, Yellow marrow, oftentimes this little part, right? This is full of yellow marrow. This is triglycerides, fat, okay? This storage of fat. And fat, we know it has this yellow color, right? So this is found in the shaft of long bones, in the medullary cavity, this middle part, medulla, this medullary cavity. Remember, medullary means middle and cavity means a space, right? So the medullary cavity is filled with fat. And this is the primary marrow type in adults, right? The middle part, all this big long middle part is full of fat. Whereas, and also we know so this is a typical adult bone. We have at the tops, at the heads, which are pretty small, we have this red marrow. And in the middle, the long part, we have all of this yellow marrow, which is fat. So blood cells production here, and this in the middle, this is fat, triglycerides. You see here, if I cut a bone in two, right? You see this yellow part over here, right? This is the fat, and you see some red marrow around. Um, you don't need to worry about this slide too much, right? But what I want you to know is in an adult, right? If I cut this bone in half, you'll see all the red bone marrow at the top and the yellow fat that's in the middle. This is all the spongy bone in the middle, right? But on top of it, you see that this lining on the outside, that's compact bone, right? Only the lining is compact bone. The middle part is spongy bone. You see the sponge-like. And in the spongy bone, you have the red bone marrow, you have the yellow one. You don't need to worry about too much, but the red bone marrow, this is the locations where you find it most. And you see that at the ends of long bone, right? That's where you see it the most. The axial skeleton has a lot of it too, but don't worry about that. Okay, so I use these words a little bit. Let me go through them. So the structure of long bone. This is a long bone, right? It's not a flat bone. It's not an irregular bone. It's not a short bone. It's a long bone because it has two heads and it has a long shaft. So long bones, they have the two ends and the long shaft. Epiphyses, right, are the wider end of the bone. These are the heads of the bone. The ends, this is one epiphysis. This is another epiphysis. Additionally, on the surface of movable joints where bones interact, there is some articular cartilage. On some epiphyses, right, over here and over here on the ends, right, if it's going to go and move with another bone, you'll have some cartilage that is just on the tippy top. And this is called our articular cartilage because you find an articulation between two bones. Another bone will come over here and articulate on this bone, right? Remember, bone has nerves and blood vessels. So if two bones rub together, that wouldn't be good. That would cause pain And this is often seen in arthritis when this cartilage is broken down. Um, Remember, cartilage has no nerves, it has no blood vessels. So if these two pieces of cartilage on this bone and on another bone that's articulating, if they clash together, it will not hurt and it will not bleed, right? So that's why we have a little protective cartilage on articulations. The diaphysis, this middle part, right? Um, this is the shaft of the bone, right? The middle section. The space inside the diaphysis is called the medullary cavity. Remember, medul means middle, right? It sounds like middle. And cavity means a space, it's hollow, right? But I told you, remember, I told you here we had some red bone marrow and, we had yellow bone marrow, fat, that got stored here, right, in the medulla. Here, in the spongy bone here, you'd have the red bone marrow in this area, in the epiphysis. Um, what else? Oh, just to help you with the name, epiphysis, epi, remember we said epi means on top? So these are the epiphyses because they're on top of the bones. They're the heads of the bone. Diaphysis, I don't know what to tell you. There's no trick to remember that. So I'll give you a minute to label your diagram over here. So pause the video and go and try to label this on your own. All right. So over here on the top, right, you have this articular cartilage, A. Where would we find compact bone? Compact bone, remember, is all this stuff on the edges here, right? You'd see all these edges. So I'm going to try to see what label that would be. I believe this would be the compact bone here, right? They kind of showed a section through it, but all of this is the compact bone. You see it over here. So I'm going to put that as B. Okay. You could have also labeled just this tiny section here, right? Probably all of this is compact bone, right? Good, good, good. All right. What's next? Next we have diaphysis. The diaphysis is the middle section of the bone, the shaft. So all of this is C, the diaphysis. The epiphysis is the head. So here is one epiphysis. I could have labeled this epiphysis as well, right? The medullary cavity is the space in between in the bone, right? It's an actual space. And over here, I see a space, right? That's in the middle. So this space that's filled with this fat here, that is the medullary cavity, E. The periosteum, remember, is the outer lining of the bone, right? This here, this sheet of connective tissue of these cells that make new bone, this is going to be H, the periosteum on the outside. The endosteum you don't see well, but it would be a lining that's on the inside. I'm just going to label it for us. This should be the endosteum. Endosteum. Okay. If you look at the epiphyses, right, remember you have this spongy bone in the middle, right? So here I zoom in. Here's my articular cartilage A, right? And in the middle here, this is not compact bone anymore. This here would be my spongy bone. You see a bunch of broken up pieces of bone, right? It looks like a sponge. It's like these scaffolds. The bones are all these little specules, these pieces, and we'll call those trabeculae soon. But this is our spongy bone that's at the epiphyses. All right? Amazing. So let's keep going. All right. So now, in terms of now we've done the gross anatomy, the big anatomy, and now we're going to the microscopic anatomy of compact bone. Compact bone. So I want to remind you, compact bone is the linings of the bone, right? Like the outer linings, not the spongy bone. So do you see here if I cut the middle here, you see these circles here? These weird circles that form the outside? That's compact bone. And so now let's go look at it in terms of this anatomy of the compact bone. Compact bone has these circles. For this here is some spongy bone. All of this here is compact bone. You see these circles, right? These circles are called osteons. They're the structural units of compact bone. This is one osteon, another osteon, another osteon here, right? So these osteons are kind of a one unit. This osteon is made up of many bone cells, though. Okay, I'll show you this. Here is one osteon over here that's cut in half. An osteon, I like to think of it like a tree. A tree has many rings in it, right? And so one ring, one big circle is one tree, right? One osteon. And there are many osteons in this bone's compact bone. So in one osteon, let's go look at this osteon, right? There is a haversian canal, a central canal. Do you see in the middle of each circle, you see these red and blue and yellow little pipes coming out? They run down the whole middle of this osteon in the central part of this osteon. So what are they? The red and the blue, they're arteries and veins, they're blood vessels, right? Because we know that bones do have blood vessels that go to them. When you need to feed all of these bone cells, right? The yellow thing is trying to depict a nerve, okay? Nerves are also in bones. When you break a bone, you will scream, right? Um, Puncturing cartilage, like the cartilage in your ear, is actually not as painful because it has no nerves, right? So it's important to know that bones have blood vessels and nerves in their central canal, right? So there are many central canals in compact bone because there are many osteons, right? Lamellae, you see in B over here, lamellae is another word for concentric layers of bone. So there are many rings, just like in a tree, many layers, and each of these layers, the white part in the middle, that is all hard bone, calcified, calcium that is calcified solid in the middle, right? So all of this is tough. And then in C, you see each of these in C is actually a bone cell. This is a lacunae, and I don't know if you could see this very well, but you see this light gray and a dark gray, right? So the light gray is called a lacunae, right? We talked about them a bit. They're little chambers, little cute houses where the bone cells live, okay? So they're chambers found between the lamellae, between the little hard matrix, you find these lacunae, and they have a little osteocyte that live inside of it. Osteocyte, osteo means bone, cyte means cell. So an osteocyte is the bone cell. So bone cells live in a little cocoon, a lacoon. They live in this little lacunae, and the osteocytes make the matrix around. So you see this little osteocyte here in its lacunae, it makes bone on this side and it makes bone on this side. The matrix, right? This cell, remember bones are the cells and they make extracellular matrix, right? They are the cells that make this hard stuff on the outside. So they kind of trap themselves sandwiched between these layers of bone that they just made. They make a bunch of bone and then they trap themselves and say, uh-oh, I'm stuck here. So I want you to know that in one osteon, right, I have many, you see each of these little spiders, many osteocytes are found, osteocytes that are in their lacunae. And these osteocytes make matrix, they make the lamellae that are around them. Now in D over here, do you see how one osteon can talk to another osteon, right? Like over here is where blood vessels come in. And they could go, the reason why they could get deep into the compact bone is because of these Volksmann canals. Volksmann canals go not centrally like this, right? They run perpendicular, and they connect blood and nerve supplies to the of the periosteum to the Haversian canals, the central canals, right? So they allow blood vessels to get deep into this bone, into the different Haversian systems. Canaliculi are different. Do you see over here this one little bone cell, right? Do you see this one bone cell has, and then here you have this other little bone cell, this other osteocyte? They talk to each other via, do you see this little blip between the two? This is called a canaliculi, a little canal that communicates and transports nutrients between this osteocyte and this one. So they allow them to communicate and to transport things to each other, right? If this cell needs to talk to this one, they will send their stuff through the little canals, the canaliculi. Volksmann canals are different. They're canals between two different osteons. Canaliculi are canals between two osteocytes. And Haversian canals are canals in the middle of one osteocyte, right? In the middle. Okay, so label the following images as instructed. So take a crack at this and then pause the video and I'll go through the answer. Alrighty, so circle one osteon. This, remember, an osteon is like the tree. This is one osteon, one unit of the compact bone. This is a second osteon here, right? You see another one here. This is a real tissue, by the way. It's super impressive. Like, how crazy is this that our bone is made up of these weird layers like this? It stuns me. So here's my osteon. Now, next. It says, draw arrows pointing to at least 3 lacunae. Remember, we're pointing to the lacunae, but the lacunae, they house the osteocytes, right? So let me just point to maybe a lacunae here, another one that was here, and another one that's here, right? I kind of drew on top of them, my bad. But you see these 3 little lacunae. Then it says over here, draw a dotted line along 2 lamellae, right? So I kind of see like a concentric circle of them here. This might not be the best, but I kind of see a circle being formed around here. So I think that between here and here, right, this is kind of like a layer, right, of all of this lamellae, this layer that kind of goes around. Between this layer, right, and this layer, this is another lamellae between this row of osteocytes and this row of osteocytes, right? You kind of see the different circles, concentric circles of solid matrix. I want you to think of this solid matrix around, right? And then it says over here to draw a star on the central canal. So the central canal is found over here and over here. What do we find in it? We find blood vessels and we find nerves, right? Amazing. So that was the microscopic anatomy of compact bone. So it was this outer bone, right, that we find here. Now, what about, at the heads over here, you have the compact bone here that are in the nice rounds. What about this stuff here, this spongy bone, right? So I'm going to look at the microscopic anatomy of spongy bone. Here's like cartilage at the ends of the bone where they articulate, right? Here's the legitimate compact bone that lines the epiphysis. And then here's the spongy bone that's deep inside the epiphysis, right? Do you see how it's all broken, right? Remember, this is called spongy bone because of its name. It looks like sponge with many holes in it, right? Now, if I take this piece of the spongy bone and I cut it in two, and I zoom into the inside of it, right? This is like cut in two, this piece of bone I cut in two. This is called a trabeculae. These little shards, rods, branches of bone, right? Call it what you want. These are called trabeculae. They're all in little pieces, right? And if you look at one trabeculae, right, they contain lamellae, right? They contain this hard matrix on these rows, concentric circles, but there's not many rows of them, right? Like over here in the osteon, we saw many, many, but here it's just one tiny little trabeculae, right? We see osteocytes in between each of the lamellae. You see this osteocyte in their lacunae, right? And over here, an osteocyte in their lacunae. We see an endosteum. Endo means on the inside, right? We see this endosteum on the inner parts, right? And we see these canaliculi. Do you see the little bone cells are talking to each other through these canals here, right? The canaliculi are there. What you'll notice though is that there are no well organized osteons. You do not see these very nice circles, groupings of circles in the spongy bone, right? Instead, you see these broken pieces and they just have their own little unit to them. So I want you to know that spongy bone does not have osteons. They do not have, if they don't have an osteon, right, a circle like this, then they won't have these blood vessels and nerves in the middle, right? So I don't see any blood vessels and nerves in the middle. The blood vessels actually just circulate around them, right? So over here, right, you don't have osteons and you have no haversian central canals in the middle. I would expect in compact bone a haversian system, this canal, central canal in the middle with blood vessels, but not over here for the spongy bone. And actually, the empty spaces in between the trabeculae, right, inside the sponge, in the holes of the sponge, this is filled with red bone marrow, right? This is where the cells that make blood cells will be. So now I talked about how is compact bone organized, how is spongy bone organized. Now we need to name the cells that are found throughout these two types of bones, right? So in both these types of bones, we will find these cells, okay? The first type of cell that you'll find is these osteoprogenitor cells, or they call them sometimes osteogenic. Genic means to make, right? Osteoprogenitor sounds like progeny. Progeny, progenitor, is your generation, you're progenerating other cells. So these are called stem cells, right? They make new bone cells. They make the progeny. They make the new cells. They're the stem cells that make other cells, right? So the function of these, they're stem cells. They can make new bone cells and they can become osteoblasts. We'll see that they could become these guys eventually. Where are they located? We find them in the periosteum and endosteum. They will make baby cells, progeny, right? Osteoblasts, osteo means bone, blasts means to build. Blast cells build. So the function of these bone cells are that they produce and secrete new bone matrix. So these cells will build matrix around them, right? So wherever new bone needs to be made, they will secrete and make new bone matrix around. You see the cell building the hard brick wall around them? That's a blast cell that's actively making hard matrix around it. Where are they located? They're lined in the central canal, in the surfaces of compact bone and trabeculae bone of spongy bone. all these blast cells in these locations, they need to make new bone sometimes, right? So you'd find them there. Osteocytes, right? Osteoprogenitor cells make babies, which become osteoblasts. And osteoblasts, once they're done doing their job and they get trapped, you see how this blast cell is making bone all around it? Eventually, this bone cell will trap itself. And you see that this osteocyte here is trapped around all of its matrix that it made, right? This is like lamellae in between the different osteocytes, right? So once it traps itself, it actually becomes mature and it becomes this osteocyte. So cytes are mature cells, right? Mature bone cells are inside their little lacunae. You don't really see their lacunae here, but they are trapped in their matrix that they made, and they're not going to move, and they kind of retire there. They do sometimes go and remodel bone. Like if you do a little micro fracture inside your bone, they'll remodel around it, but they can't move around and make new bone, right? So they remodel bone and they maintain it, but they're not making actively new bone in a big way, right? They're just stuck in their little matrix, and maybe they might fix little parts here and there, but they're kind of stuck in their matrix. Now, in comparison to these cells, right, we have the total opposite, which are called osteoclasts. Clast cells, they cut up bone, they chop, they chew, right? So the function of these is to break down matrix, to release minerals. Sometimes you have this bone stuff and you want to get rid of it. The hard matrix, if you want to chew this matrix away, you will go and get rid of this wall, this brick wall, the hard calcium phosphate. So these cells, they break down matrix. Why might you want to break it down? Don't worry too much about this, but sometimes we lack calcium in our blood, and so we need to go chew off of the bones and release it into the blood. So actually, this is why oftentimes elderly folks are given calcium pills, because their bones are very brittle and easily breakable. That's because maybe their calcium is low and their bone osteoclasts are trying to chew their bone to try to put that calcium in homeostasis. Sometimes, though, you need to remodel bone, right? Sometimes you need to chew off some bits. When you build a house, right, you don't just build things. You sometimes dig down a bit to make a foundation, right? So sometimes clasts and cutting are necessary. How do they do this cutting? Importantly, they secrete acids and digestive enzymes that dissolve the bone matrix, that break down the matrix. Where is this located? It's located pretty much where the blast cells are. So on the surface of compact bone, trabeculate bone, this is where bone usually wants to grow, right? And make new bone. So here's an example, right, of our bone. You see osteocytes would be trapped in the middle, right? Like over here, all of these osteocytes, right? We call these osteocytes because they're trapped there, right? But maybe on the ends here, right, we'd have some osteoblasts, osteoclasts, and osteoprogenitors, right? So osteoblasts, you see some osteoblasts that are lining the ends here. They maybe make new bone to increase the width of the bone, right? Or the length, right? Osteogenic cells are also here, right? The progenitors that make new osteoblasts are here. Osteoclasts in the middle here, sometimes, remember I told you this is hollow? How do you think this became hollow? This osteoclast, it chewed in the middle over here, and it resorbs bone, we say. It will chew it and make some calcium. Don't worry about this question too much, but I want you to think about this one now, okay? So this question asks you, osteoporosis is a common condition in older adults, especially women. And actually it happens a lot in biological women that are older because hormones are changing a lot during menopause, let's say, right? So due to these fluctuations in hormones, we'll see later on, bones become weak due to an imbalance between osteoblasts and clasts. So, which type of cell would be more active and which type of cell is less active in an individual with osteoporosis? Explain your reasoning. So, the cell, I'll let you a minute to try to think of this. All right. So, the most active one in this patient that has osteoporosis, look at the holes here. They're huge, right? That spongy bone, the scaffolds that were there are no longer that great, right? So, the most active cells, I would say, are the osteoclasts, right? Osteoclast, right? The reasoning for this, right, is that they remove bone. So maybe they're too active, right? And they're just chewing away at this bone. The least active ones, I would say, would be the osteoblasts, right? Osteoblast. Why? Because the osteoblast form bones. Here we're chewing away, so probably the chewers are working better than these are the builders, right? They build bone, the osteoblasts. So I would expect that these osteoblasts wouldn't be as active, wouldn't be building as much bone in this osteoporosis patient, right? Okay. This is for your review sake, but you know what? Stare at this for a while. I really love this picture. This is like a chop through the diaphysis here, right? And I really like this picture. All the concepts we talked about are in this picture. You see that this is the periosteum, right? Forget about the fibrous and cellular layer. This is the periosteum. This is compact bone here with many little osteons over here. This is, in each osteon, you have a central canal, a Haversian system. You have Volksmann canals that are here, right? Talking to each osteon. You have the central canal, the Haversian system in the middle. You have lamellae in between each of the little circles, right? In the middle here, you have some spongy bone, trabecular bone. And you would see, right, if you looked at one little trabeculae, here you would see some osteoblasts all around, and you'd see maybe some osteoclasts. You'd see the osteocytes in the middle, right? They're stuck in between their matrix, okay? So I'll give you a minute to try to fill out this table, the difference between compact and spongy bone. Go pause the video, please, and go look at the previous slides to see what we put here. All right, so in compact bone, do we find osteoblasts? Yeah, we oftentimes make new compact bone. We also oftentimes make new spongy bone. So we would expect to see osteoblasts. Do we see Volksmann canals? Remember, Volksmann canals are what over, let me just change my color. Over here, when we talk in between two osteons, we have Volksmann canals. So in compact bone, definitely I would expect it. I would not expect it in spongy bone. Okay. Endosteum, right? I would expect to find this in my compact bone, right? We talked about the inside, the endosteum, right? And we also said that this was called the endosteum in the spongy bone, so I would also find endosteum here. Osteons with central canals, would I find those in compact bones? Of course. This is one osteon, right? And you'd find it here. In trabeculae over here, you would not find it. In the spongy bone, you would not find that. Trabeculae, oh, I just gave you the answer. Here's the trabeculae, all these little pieces of bones. I do see it in spongy bone. I do not see it in compact bone. Then, what do we have? We have osteocytes in lacunae. I see an osteocyte in their lacunae here, 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 right? I would also see them here, here, right? So I do expect these to be there in both. Canaliculi, right? Let's go remind ourselves what those are. Canaliculi are the little branches that talk between between osteocytes, between the cells, right? I see them in this trabeculae, and I also see them talking to each other through these canaliculi here, right? So yes and yes, I would see those. Okay. Next, bone growth and bone growth and ossification. What does ossification means? To ossify means to make new new bone. So at about the 6th week after fertilization, a cartilaginous skeleton is apparent. When we're in a fetus, right, at week 6, our bones are all made out of cartilage. It's this whole cartilage skeleton, right? And slowly it starts to ossify. It starts to become bone. It transfers from cartilage to bone. Ossification is the process by which cartilage skeleton is replaced by bone. So there's two types of ossification I need you to know about. Intramembranous ossification is the development of spongy bone from connective tissue in the developing embryo, and it only forms the skull and the clavicles. That's pretty much all I need you to know for intramembranous ossification, is that it's actually what will eventually make the spongy bone, right? And it happens pretty much just in the skull and the clavicles. Endochondral ossification is the most common type of bone growth. It's seen in all other bones of the body, where the initial hyaline cartilage in fetus is the bone-shaped structure that gradually gets replaced by bone. So all of these long bones here, they are just cartilage in week 6 of fertilization, and then they slowly get ossified. They get turned into bone. This is how intramembranous ossification works in the skull and the clavicles. This is the process by which it goes through. I don't need you to know this for the exam. But basically, all of this cartilage becomes bone, and it becomes these spiky trabeculae, right? Remember, spongy bone equals the trabeculae. Remember I said the second part is most other types of bones, right? Well, that's called endochondral ossification. And what is endochondral ossification? Endo means inside, chondro means the cartilage, right? So I need you to know these steps quite well. So in this developing fetus that is making its new bone, right, we just have these cartilage bits. Step 1 of this is that the chondrocytes over here, what are chondrocytes? Chondro is for cartilage, cytes means cells. The chondrocytes in the middle here of the cartilage, they enlarge, right? As they grow, they enlarge and they die because diffusion distances are too great, and these cells leave behind their empty lacunae. So you end up having these empty lacunae around here. Why do the cells die? This is key here. You need to know that the cells die because as cartilage grows in size, the cells occur further and further away from their blood supply, right? We know that when cells go away from their blood supply, they are going to die. So here there's actually some blood vessels in the middle, but as the cells grow out, there's less and less cells. There's less and less blood supply, right? Because the blood supply was in the middle. So as they grow out, they die. I want you to think of it a bit like skin. That outer layer of skin, right, is dead cells because the connective tissue in the bottom, that feeds the epithelium. And as the cells migrate away from that blood supply, the diffusion distance is way too big, and gases and food cannot get to those cells over here, so they die, right? So diffusion is also impacted because the cartilage begins to calcify. So chondrocytes at the center of the growing cartilage model. I like to think of this as the cartilage model, right? This is the cartilage that will make the new bone. And it's like a model that you will then ossify on top of. So they die, and then the matrix will calcify. So enlarging chondrocytes within the calcifying matrix are over here. Step 2, which you see over here, osteogenic cells on the outer surface of the cartilage differentiate into osteoblasts. So over here on the outside, right, you're going to have some of these osteoblasts that are going to grow on the outside and start forming bone on this outside, because osteoblasts, they grow on this outer part, right? And they begin the process of ossification here. These osteoblasts, they start to make some bone. So they start laying out a thin outer layer in the bone shaft. You see this yellow? They're starting to form. This is the only place where you start having bone here. Okay, so this yellow part is this outer bone. This thin layer of bone, called a bone collar, because it's literally like a collar, a dog collar, around the middle here, right? It's not inside, it's only on the outside. Grows along the outer edges of the cartilage shaft, right? Blood vessels start to appear adjacent to the bone collar, but they don't penetrate into the bone yet, okay? Step 3, though, blood vessels start to grow and they invade, right? They break through this periosteum, and they invade the inner parts of the cartilage, right? But with them, do you see this yellow here, which was their bone cells? They pushed in some of those osteoblasts, and now osteoblasts are found in the middle. So these osteoblasts first occupy the empty lacunae that were left behind by the chondrocytes. Remember, chondrocytes died and they just left their lacunae. So the osteoblasts will go into the lacunae and be happy. They have a new house. And they begin to produce some spongy bone in the middle along the inner shafts, and they start growing towards the epiphysis. This bone starts to grow inwards, boom, 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 to the epiphyses. The central portion of so this growth of bone in the middle, right? We call this primary ossification centers. It's the first place, the center where we make bone. We're gonna see secondary ones in a minute. This is called the primary ossification center. Next, this is endochondral ossification. Next step is that the osteoclasts eventually break down the spongy bone and create the medullary cavity in the diaphysis. Remember I told you this inner part does not have spongy bone. It's empty and hollow and actually has fat stored here. To make this empty, right? I just filled up the cavity here with bone. So to make this empty, osteoclasts, this is key. The chewers, the cutters, osteoclasts, they break this bone down in the middle to make it hollow so that fat could be stored here eventually. So the medullary cavity in the diaphysis is hollow. Throughout this process, epiphyseal cartilage at each end of the bone continues to grow and adds to the length of the bone. Remember here, we still had some cartilage, right? So this cartilage, it continues to grow up, right? And it lengthens the bone, right? Hormones released during puberty will cause the chondrocytes in the epiphyseal cartilage to divide more quickly, causing your growth spurt. So when puberty starts, these little cells, right, are affected by hormones like sex hormones, and that will cause the chondrocytes boom, 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 to build even faster and grow faster. Okay. Then step 5, blood vessels eventually will invade the centers of the epiphyses here and here. So this is like a secondary ossification center made, right? So this begins ossification of secondary centers, right? We start making bone over here separately to the middle part. So in the centers of the epiphyses, you're going to have bone building, but the resulting spongy bone remains intact and is not removed. Here, spongy bone was removed, but here we will leave spongy bone, right? We saw that in our picture. And so a thin layer of articular cartilage will remain on the outer surface of the epiphyses. We're going to see in a minute that this outer layer here will leave a little bit of cartilage. Remember, that's an articular cartilage over here. So we're going to see that in a minute. So here's the big steps, right? I want you to read through this yourself. These steps are going to be important for your exam. Now, I want to go back to a step that I kind of glossed over. And this is, when you longitudinally grow your bone, what does it mean to longitudinally grow? Long, when you grow in the long way. Not, we're going to see there's appositional growth where you grow in the width, right? If my bone got fatter this way, that would be not longitudinal. When I talk about lengthening, longitudinal growth, I mean up and down. The bone grows at each of the ends longer, right? Ossification continues. This growth in long term continues into adolescence, right? Remember, I need you to know this, that in longitudinal growth, in adolescence, when you hit puberty, you start growing long, right? You keep growing. And it lagging behind cartilage growth in the epiphyseal plate. This thing here is called the epiphyseal plate, okay? This is a plate of cartilage, right? And this is bone over here, right? So this cartilage keeps growing up, and the bone keeps growing up. And eventually, this cartilage at the end of puberty will slow down, and the ossification over here of bone will start breaking down the cartilage and turning it into the bone, right? And so ossification does not cause your bone to elongate. It's really this cartilage that allows you to grow. So basically what happens, right, is that we stop growing because this cartilage gets turned into bone. Once the cartilage is ossified, your bones can no longer grow. So when there's cartilage, when this epiphyseal plate, this plate at the epiphysis is cartilage, you will grow in length, your bones. When you see that this plate is bone and ossified, you will not be able to grow, right? During puberty, I need you to know that during puberty, this plate is cartilage. During actually, as a kid and during puberty, this is cartilage because you still grow in length. When you hit adulthood, this plate will stop growing and it'll be removed, and this plate will turn into bone, okay? So let me go through this in a better picture. Over here, right, this is called the primary ossification center. It's full of bone. You see some bone, some compact bone on the ends, some spongy bone in the middle, right? This is the secondary ossification center. You see here in blue, this is bone 2. You see little specks of bone, right? And they're on each of the sides of this epiphyseal plate. What is this epiphyseal plate? This is cartilage, right? If you are in a kid or an adolescent, this is cartilage. And in the epiphyseal plate, right, this causes bone elongation. I need you to know this very well. This cartilage, if I zoom into the epiphyseal plate, you have bone up here, bone here. This cartilage, right, this growth causes bone elongation. Why? Because these cartilage, right, they grow and divide in columns, and they keep dividing over and over, and they push this end of the bone up, right? And these cartilages, they actually start to die. And so this cartilage piece keeps moving up, 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 up. And this cartilage here is pushing up and making new cartilage on top and pushing the bone up, right? So this cartilage keeps moving up, and this cartilage here keeps dying. So this epiphyseal plate keeps getting pushed up, 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 right? So I need you to know that during adolescence, right, and during childhood, this epiphyseal plate is cartilage, and it allows you to keep growing because the chondrocytes inside, they keep dividing in these long columns and pushing the bone up. As the bone is elongating, growing cartilage, right, is going up, 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 up. Adjacent osteoblasts convert the cartilage to bone. So remember I told you here, the cartilage is dying, right? Because it's getting away from the blood source. So these are dying. And so bone is, osteoblasts are making more and more bone in this region. So as your plate of cartilage moves up, the bone is calcifying and making new bone on top, okay? Eventually, though, what I need you to know is that eventually cartilage growth will slow down. At the end of puberty, when hormones stop spiking, cartilage doesn't get those hormones to tell it to go fast, and they start slowing down, the end of your growth spurt. And so the osteoblasts here that are boom, 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 making new bone here and calcifying this, right? They will go and they will ossify, they will fill up the bone in this region, right? And eat away at the cartilage. And this epiphyseal plate will all be turned into osteoblasts. They will all be turned into these bone cells, right? So osteoblasts will turn this into bone and trap in the matrix. I don't have a good picture, but oh, actually, I think I will have a good picture. So let's look at skeletal growth during life. Ossification occurs through life, right? Babies have more hyaline cartilage than children, and children have more than adults, right? And on and on and on. Cartilage is slowly replaced with bone, as I told you, throughout development, and remodeling of osteoclasts carve out the medullary cavity in the long bones, and they remove the spongy bone that occupied it previously. Now, this is what I was talking about. Do you see this 3-year-old bone? Do you see that this bone here in the palm of the hand, right, has a long part and it has a dot on the top? And there is actually a space between the dot and the the bone here. This here, the dot and it looks like an eye, right? The dot and the long part, this is one bone that's connected together. But if you zoom in to the x-ray and you see the space there, the only reason why there's a space between them is because in an x-ray, cartilage is not it is not seen in an x-ray. So x-rays only see bone. You see the same here. Do you see this finger bone? You see a dot on top. This is actually one entire bone connected together. But the dot on the end, right? That space in between is actually full of cartilage. Remember I told you here, cartilage, the epiphyseal plate, right? Well, this is cartilage in the middle, right? Here you see this bone here, the long bone. You see a space between the dot on top and this, but this is all one bone. And in the middle between these two things is not bone, it's cartilage, and you don't see it on the x-ray. But as you go to 8 years old, 10 years old, 15, do you see that this space is filled up with bone? You no longer see the space in between, right? In all of the long bones, you see that that space gets filled in and you no longer have that space. That means that it got ossified and turned into bone. So at the end of puberty, sex hormones accelerate osteoblast activity. I told you that in puberty, the cartilage slows down, osteoblasts speed up, and they start ossifying and turning. You see at 15 years old here, you fill in these gaps, right? So ossification outpaces cartilage formation at the epiphyseal plate and signifying the end of bone elongation. So remodeling and another form of growth persists throughout the rest of life, but we will not have we will not have any more longitudinal bone growth. That's key. Bones stop growing in length at one point, right? They could still grow in width, but they cannot grow in length. And they could grow by remodeling. Like if you break a bone, you could remodel that area, right? Okay, so ossification throughout the course of our life, right? This, don't worry too much about it. This is just talking about the fact that peak bone density actually occurs in adolescence and then it goes down with age, right? So remember I told you here, this is bone lengthening. And the other form of bone growth is bone appositional bone growth. Appendage or appendicular means to the side, right? Like our appendages, like our arms and our legs, they're on the side of us. So appositional, I like to think that means to the side of the bone, right? Appositional bone growth is changing the bone diameter. And this never stops growing in your life, okay? Appositional bone growth continues as osteoblasts lay down matrix on the outer surface under the periosteum. So over here, right, on the periosteum, you have some bone, and it will add more and more bone. Osteoclasts on the inside will chew all of this inner part. So osteoblasts deposit new bone on the outside. Osteoclasts chew in the middle, and it changes this bone, right? If the osteoclast didn't chew, our inner part would be thicker and our bones would be super heavy, and we wouldn't even be able to support our weight, right? So this, what I need you to know about this appositional growth is that this growth is not limited to puberty. This bone growth happens forever in adulthood, okay? I need you to know that. And this bone remodeling, I need you to know that what controls appositional growth, right? Like right now, you and I were we're out of our pubertal stage, right? And we can have our bones increase in this inner part. We could have it be fatter or shorter, right? Like they could start chewing on the inside and making them bigger in diameter or smaller. But what is it that makes it change, right? Like in you and I that are done puberty, what is it that changes this diameter? Why would it do that? This happens, I need you to know, because remodeling is influenced by mechanical stresses you encounter in your daily life. If you use your bones a lot, right? If there's physical stresses on them, it'll change it. So let's take a look at what would affect that, all right? Normal bone growth requires calcium. I think you know this, right? Bone is pretty much, it's made of calcium phosphate. So most of it is calcium. This calcium, right, must be needed. So calcium is very, very important. But I don't need you to know too much. We get calcium from certain foods, dairy products. That's why they say drink your milk, right? Blah, 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 right? This is why actually in pregnancy, oftentimes they will have this lack in bone density, and they're actually told to take some calcium because it's important for the fetus to develop their bones. You don't need to know too much about this. Vitamin D, very crucial in bones, but I don't care too much about it. Vitamin C also, and vitamin A. So just know you don't need to know anything here for your information. These vitamins are crucial, so you need to have them. Hormones, this is what I need us to know. There are different hormones that are involved in bone growth. There's growth hormone released by the pituitary gland. This influences the activity of somatic cells, including chondrocyte division. So basically, growth hormone makes different parts of the body grow, and therefore that is an important hormone in bone development. That's all I need you to know. Just for funsies, if you have too much growth hormone as a child, you will develop a condition called gigantism. And in children, it's called acromegaly. In children, it's gigantism. In adults, it's called acromegaly. And you do get very, very big. A lack of growth hormone is called dwarfism. And so this is when you don't have enough of this, and those bones, they will not grow. Another hormone that's important is actually the thyroid and parathyroid hormones. The thyroid and parathyroid glands, they regulate calcium through retention, absorption, and excretion of these. So I need you to know that the name calcitonin and parathyroid hormone and growth hormone. These are all three types of hormone that affect bone. You will see this a lot in 806 in the next bio course. Calcitonin is released by the thyroid and it will cause bone to be deposited. If you have if you have decreased bone calcium in your blood, right? You will go and trigger this pathway down below. If you have too much calcium, the thyroid will release calcitonin, which will deposit calcium in your bones. It'll deposit it more in your bones to keep it in storage, right? If you have low calcium, parathyroid, which is 4 little glands at the back of your thyroid, they will release parathyroid hormone, PTH, which will stimulate the osteoclast to start chewing, the inside of the bone, and that will release calcium into the blood, right? Okay. Oh, sorry. There was this fourth hormone that is important. Sex hormones, testosterone or progesterone, estrogens, all of these that are peaking during uh, during puberty, they are involved in osteoblast activity and proliferation, right? Interestingly, this is just for fun. Here you see that bone mass peaks at around puberty in males and females, and then it goes down over time. Do you see it in biological females, this big spike down at this time? You don't see that in males, right? This is often in menopause. There's these changes in hormones, and women in menopause, they are oftentimes followed up for a loss in bone density and frail bones at this age. So it's very common to see this at an age around this age over here. What else? Bone remodeling. Okay. This is the last little part. Sometimes, I told you that, okay, let's kind of look over this. In fetal development, right? We talked about different types of growth, right? We talked about the fact that we have endochondral ossification that'll grow our bones long. And I believe, what is the other thing that we talked about? We talked about over here, let's go through a little summary. We have intramembranous ossification. We don't care much about it, but we know it's in the skull and clavicles. And we have endochondral ossification, right? It's those, you start replacing the chondro, you start replacing that cartilage by bone, right? So we saw that. We saw how it lengthened like this. We saw longitudinal growth, right? In this lengthening, this goes up until, this type of growth occurs up until puberty, right? Then we saw that we have this appositional bone growth, and that happens even after puberty, right? During our whole lives. We have this thickening and thinning of bone sometimes. Okay. Now, in addition to all this, throughout our life, sometimes we break off pieces of bone, right? Like we have a fracture and we need to remodel that bone, right? So that's our last section. Bones stop growing longer, but they still remain dynamic. Remodeling occurs through your life, leading to recycling and renewal of both organic and mineral components of bone. So, osteocytes heal small microfractures. I told you about this. On their own, osteocytes could still make matrix, but only small little microfractures around them, right? Um, the ratios of osteoclasts and osteoblasts will influence bone density. And you know, the chewers, the clasts, they chew off, the builders, they make new bone, right? And I told you this before. This was essential. Physical strain and stresses on bone, that's what causes it to accumulate microfractures, which need to be healed by the osteocytes, right? Exercise causes muscle contractions to pull on the origins and insertions of bones, influencing bone deposition. So this increases osteoblast activity to fix up the little microfracture. And on other areas, bone is removed, so it could be added elsewhere. Interestingly, a lack of stress, physical strain, causes thinning and brittleness due to inactivity. So, exercising causes stresses on the bone and causes bone to get broken a little bit, these microfractures, and keep getting rebuilt. So, it makes these bones nice and thick because the osteoblasts learn to make more bone, right? When you don't have physical activity and no stress, by stress, I mean physical stress, like movement, right? Then this will thin the bones and make it brittle because the osteoblasts aren't taught to keep making bone. How do cells know where to remodel? Stresses stimulate mechanoreceptors, blah, blah. I don't care about this. What do membrane proteins do? They are ion channels. Nobody cares. How do strains and stresses cause remodeling? Changes. Okay, I don't care about this. I should have put a big X through this. Okay. All right. This, however, I will go through. So, bone fractures, right? Extreme stresses and forces from an unusual direction can cause bones to break. Um, so, you could have these simple fractures in the bone. They're also called closed. It means that there's this happened within the bone and there's no skin. The bone didn't penetrate to the skin. When the bone breaks and penetrates into the skin, this carries the risk of infection. It carries the risk of blood loss. And so this is called an open fracture or a compound fracture. So this I don't really care about, but what you need to, so don't worry about the types of fractures, but I need you to know that then we need to repair this somehow, right? Repairing of bone fractures is influenced by the presence of intact blood vessels and cells in the periosteum and endosteum and occur via three main steps: reactive stage, reparative, and remodeling. So, first, a hematoma will form. It'll inflame and it'll kill the bone cells. Then they'll repair, the osteoblasts and chondrocytes proliferate, and then remodeling occurs with the spongy bone. Let me go through these stages. What you need to know. Immediately after, the first stage is called the reactive stage. You just broke your bone, right? Immediately after the fracture, a fracture hematoma is formed. Hema means blood, like Hema, Quebec. Toma means there's this bubbling of the blood, right? They form this bleeding, right? This internal bleeding. Damaged blood vessels lead to bleeding, and we know that there's clots that could form, right? So there's this clot forming, and it swells the bone up. A lack of blood flow kills osteocytes in either direction of the fracture. So here there's dead bone because the blood vessels broke. Here, in the reparative stage, after the hematoma callus formation proceeds, cells in the endosteum, right? Here are cells in the endosteum. They rapidly divide, and their daughter cells, their baby cells, they move into the fracture zone to create an internal callus, right? Do you see how here it's forming this internal callus? It's making bone in this space that was broken, right? This callus is made of spongy bone and connects the inner edges of the fracture together, right? This is why when you break a bone and have a fracture, they tell you to wait a bit before doing exercise because although it's healed and there's going to be spongy bone is not that strong, right? Cells of the periosteum, the outer part, right? They divide rapidly to create the external callus. So this is actually going to be made of cartilage on the outside because you have these cells in the external part. And the spongy bone that stabilizes the outer edges of the fracture will start to come in. Last stage, remodeling stage. Afterwards, spongy bone formation continues, right? And they will meet in the middle, right? And osteoblasts replace the cartilage at these ends in the external callus via endochondral ossification. Fragments of dead bone are eventually resorbed and replaced. And we repair ends as all the spongy bone is replaced by compact bone eventually, right? New bone may be stronger and thicker than previous bone, actually. It might be nice and big, right? And bulbous, and it will be actually reinforced at that injury site. And that is all. So thank you for that. And that's what we will have for the bone section.